Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is chapter 28 of the American Pageant, titled Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt. If you don't know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. The theory of the leisure class, an essay attacking the elitist class. It represents the growing distaste for the wealthy class coming from the baseline of the population, and that they didn't view immense wealth as progress for America, but rather something that needs to be checked as it is harmful exploitation. So this is just a backfire sort of from the lower classes against the wealthy class who are becoming more disconnected from society, and that obviously affected the social fabric. How the Other Half Lives, a report from the New York Sun about the NYC slums. The report spread national awareness to the miserable conditions in cities that most people live in, highlighting the diseases and other forms of misery. It heavily influenced Theodore Roosevelt. So as more awareness was being created for how the wealthy class was becoming more disconnected from society, there was also growing awareness on the other end of the spectrum for the mistreatment and bad living conditions of the lower classes. Muckrakers, yellow journalists trying to expose evil. So remember back to yellow journalists who were very emotional driven journalism. They went to great lengths to expose stories to the public that they knew would garner a lot of attention, as people love scandals. That's just human nature, it's still the way it is today. They faced criticism for their practices, but their stories were popular and successful. When you're trying to expose sort of the establishment, you're naturally going to face a lot of criticism because people are comfortable with the establishment. But a lot of their stories were true and real, and that had a great long-term impact on social change. Initiative, referendum, and recall strategies meant to curb legislative power. This is some AP Gov sort of here. All three plans were meant to give the people more power over the government by having the power to propose laws, approve laws, and remove lawmakers who aren't serving them adequately. It also served as a way to check the wealthy class who are buying out the government with bribery. The main thing about initiative, referendum, and recall is the power of the people, the majority class, which obviously aren't the wealthy class. The majority class to get involved with the government and affect change in the government. Australian ballot, a system that allows private voting. It helped to limit the amount of bribery because wealthy bribers could not tell whether the people they would bribe actually voted for them, so it discouraged bribers who lost trust with their constituents. So wealthy politicians, the wealthy class, could no longer come to power using their money. 17th Amendment established a direct election of U.S. senators. It gave more political power to the people because instead of rich people being able to buy out bribery-prone legislatures, they had to garner the support of the people by competing in popular elections. The 17th Amendment helped to rid upper levels of government and corruption. Remember back to the original U.S. Constitution, the way senators were chosen was through the legislature. They would pick their state's senators, but now since the people could directly elect senators, people could no longer bribe the legislature, or powerful politicians can no longer put the people they want into the Senate. So more of a direct connection from the government to the people instead of going through these kind of loops and barriers that would disconnect the majority of the people. City manager system, depoliticized representation for control over cities. People could create councils that would assist mayors and other elected officials, which helped to counteract corruption. It was more efficient to get the people to create change rather than having to run in through the political system. So there's a growing trend here of to counter government corruption, to counter government inefficiency. They're trying to get the people more involved. Robert La Follette, I don't know, progressive governor of Wisconsin. He was a very passionate and militant progressive within the Republican Party, who on his rise to governorship, he rid Wisconsin from being controlled by corporations. He also helped to regulate public utilities, which made them run more efficiently. Florence Kelley, Illinois first factory inspector. She helped to start the action against poor factory conditions and worker conditions. She eventually took over the National Consumers League, which encouraged women to advocate for laws protecting women and children in the industrial sphere. So this is sort of a labor movement connected type activity. Mueller v. Oregon, landmark Supreme Court case. It decided that the government must make laws protecting women in the workplace constitutional, which helped to alter the existing system in which employers control the workplace. It was in part discriminatory by only focusing on women and not everyone. but it was a landmark in the progressivist movement. It was one of the moments in female activism that helped create the American welfare system. So although it's sort of inherently discriminatory by focusing on only women, it's kind of the same thing as the Equal Rights Amendment, which you'll see much later in APUSH, where even if it's discrimination, if you're trying to help a certain affected class, a discriminated against class, trying to target them and help them is held up under the court. Lochner v. New York, Supreme Court case setting back the labor movement. It was decided in New York that made a law regulating a 10-hour workday unconstitutional, which set back the popular progressive labor movement for regulating labor hours, although years later it was eventually passed. Obviously now, labor hours and worker hours are a lot more regulated. You have your traditional 9 to 5, and then you have your longer work days. But it was a struggle initially for the labor movement to get more regulated hours. The Square Deal, Roosevelt's plan for control over big corporations, protection for consumers, and conserving the environment. This is a big part of Teddy Roosevelt's presidential initiative. His plan influenced many laws and bodies that carried out this plan. It put more of an emphasis, coming straight from the president, on curbing business power and malpractices and uplifting the labor movement. So more and more you're going to start seeing in the progressive era, progressive presidents siding on behalf of laborers and targeting big corporations that were controlling a lot of power, because the government has sort of their own self-interest to curb corporation power because the government is fighting for power. So it's sort of a weird but good teamwork almost between the government and the laborers and the majority of the people. Elkins Act, law that regulated railroad corruption. It made the rebate system illegal and punishable by hefty fines, a system where railroad companies would lower prices for companies that accepted them based on various deals, bribes, and other corrupt acts. So these big, powerful railroad companies could no longer side with big corporations and uplift their power sort of equally. Upton Sinclair, socialist and author of The Jungle. His novel, intended to bring attention to the mistreatment of workers in the meat industry, actually had more of an effect on revealing the gross practices that went into producing and selling the meat, which appalled consumers. It inspired movements to investigate facilities that produced and sold food items. This is a weird personal anecdote, but I remember reading this and thinking it wasn't really a big deal, but I actually wrote an entire essay on a test about Upton Sinclair. So if you ever have a question about progressive era reformers, Upton Sinclair is a great one to write an essay about. Meat Inspection Act allowing for federal inspection of meat products. This is stemming right from the Upton Sinclair thing. It helped to rid the unsanitary meat products from the markets and also encouraged companies to better their practices so they could earn the government seal for their exports. Although ruthless, big companies could drive out smaller companies who could not afford to improve their practices. So overall, it helped the companies that had the resources to put in better practices to make their meat products safer, but it did serve the overall larger public health purpose of just making sure that people's food was safe. Hetchy Valley, kind of a weird name, controversy over building a dam in San Francisco. It pinned conservationists who felt that the government should use land responsibly against preservationists who felt that the government should leave land alone, against each other, although they were seemingly on similar sides. They're both obviously environmentalists, but they both viewed how the government's relationship with, nature should be. Roosevelt conservationists had to battle corporate greed as well as romantic environmentalists. So some people felt the government could use land to preserve it, but also use it in a good and responsible way. And then more sort of nature-loving, romantic environmentalists wanted the government to just leave it completely alone. Roosevelt panic, short but severe economic crash in 1907. It tainted public opinion on Roosevelt because his aggressive reforms were blamed for the economic downturn, and his harsh responses to criticism did not sit well either. So the progressive movement, progressivism, was blamed for the economic crash. It had positive, long-lasting effects in which the panic encouraged passing of monetary reform that allowed banks to back more currency in times of panic. So as with a lot of economic crashes, they create panic and hardship, but they also lead to the most impactful reform, because when because when problems start to hit the public's wallets, that's when the most reform and lawmaking starts to happen. William H. Taft, Republican 1908 nominee appointed by Roosevelt, so he's a Roosevelt disciple basically. Although he was nothing special, he was sufficient enough to carry on Roosevelt's progressive policies, and his victory in 1908 displayed Roosevelt's lasting influence on politics in the country. So even though Roosevelt had done his 8 years and was on his way out, he got basically a copy of him to enter in office. Dollar diplomacy, economic practice of investing American dollars abroad. Although it received some blowback, it gave America the edge over other countries by tying foreign areas to the United States dollar, which increased political imperialist power abroad, but was also a powerful source of economic prosperity domestically. So America was definitely asserting their economic power over other countries by converting them to the dollar. Rule of reason, decision that only unreasonable trusts would be busted. The fine print rule protected many trusts if the courts could not prove any malpractice or unreasonable restrictions that large companies were doing, which limited the scope of antitrust laws and regulations. So trust busting obviously is trust busting being the practice of breaking up, large corporations who were kind of consolidating a lot of power in their whatever economic sphere they were in. But this sort of principle was basically if the corporations weren't doing anything malicious and outright wrong, then they wouldn't have an incentive, or they don't have a reason to break them up, which is fair, but it does limit the scope of the corporate power breaking. Payne-Aldrich bill that raised tariffs on many goods. Congress was initially called in session to lower tariffs, but when Taft signed the bill that increased tariffs, he lost the progressive wing of his party. The Payne-Aldrich situation split the Republican Party. Some more progressive Republicans wanted to lower tariffs to limit the government's protections of big business, but Taft kind of abandoned that when he signed an increase in tariffs, so that was a big hit to the Republican Party and their coalition. Woodrow Wilson, Democratic nominee for president. He was a sweeping progressive who gave the Democratic Party a new vision and light, aided by the New Freedom Program. He had a quick rise in politics due to his abilities to not succumb to others and pass strong policy. He defeated Roosevelt and Taft in 1912 and revived the Democratic Party when it came to national office. So the Democratic Party have basically been dead since the Civil War, but they came back in great triumph actually with the Woodrow Wilson victory in 1912. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.